Trump promises that his decisions will make the United States richer and powerful than ever. But what if he is wrong? The last time the US took a similar way, the world has come into economic collapse. In 1930, protectionist tariffs were imposed with the promise of strengthening the American industry. The result? World retaliation, brutal drop in commerce, and the Great Depression. Now Trump wants to repeat the strategy. Is the story about to repeat itself? Today, the American economy is at a critical point. The country consumes more than it produces, while China does the opposite. It produces more than it consumes. This created a gigantic global imbalance. Can Trump's proposed rates be the solution to reverse this picture? Or can they trigger an even worse crisis? What really happens when a country imposes tariffs? They protect industry and jobs, or in the end, who pays this account is the consumer himself. How will China, the world's largest exporter, react to this policy? What is at stake here is not just the economic future of the US, but of the entire global system. If tariffs work, the United States can recover its position as an industrial leader. If they fail, they can trigger a domino effect that will shake the world economy. So, the question that does not want to silence: will Trump's decisions save or destroy the American economy? Tariffs look like a simple solution, taxing imported products to strengthen the national industry. But in practice, the economy does not work so directly. When the government imposes a fare on a foreign product, the price of this item rises. This should make national products more competitive. But what almost no one says is that in the end, this account always falls on the consumer. In the 1930s, the US imposed tariffs on more than 20,000 imported products. The idea was to protect US jobs and strengthen the economy. But what happened was the opposite. Other countries retaliated, creating their own rates against American. In products, global trade plummeted, and what was supposed to be a protective strategy ended up aggravating the Great Depression. The big question is, are the conditions today different? In 1930, the US was an industrialized country and produced more than they consumed. Today, the opposite happens. The United States depend on imports to supply its population and maintain the high level of consumption. This means that any increase in tariffs can generate inflation, making essential products for Americans more expensive. But there is another side of this debate. Trump's advocates argue that these tariffs are needed to re-end the US. They believe that when making imported products more expensive, there will be an incentive for companies to manufacture within the country, generating jobs and reducing external dependence. So who's right? Are tariffs a strategy needed to strengthen the American economy, or just a historical error being repeated? To better understand the impact of tariffs, we need to look at the largest opponent of the United States on global trade, China. Unlike the US, the Chinese economy was built with a massive production model and low internal consumption. This means that the country depends on exports to maintain its growth accelerated. And who is the largest buyer of these exports? Exactly the United States. This model made China the largest manufacturing power in the world, while the US went through a process of deindustrialization. For decades, US companies have migrated their factories to Asia, attracted to lower production costs. The result? The United States has become a consumer-based economy, importing billions of dollars in Chinese products while accumulating gigantic commercial deficits. Trump believes rates can correct this imbalance. By taxing Chinese products, he wants to force companies to produce again on American soil. But does this really work? The story shows that it is not that simple. China has several ways of retaliation, from devaluing its currency to keep its competitive products to making it difficult to enter American products into the Chinese market. In addition, many economists warn of a dangerous side effect: inflation. If imported products are more expensive and internal production cannot supply demand quickly, prices may trigger. This means that the American consumer would pay more for just about everything from electronics to food and clothing. So, the dilemma continues. Will rates really strengthen the American economy, or just make it more expensive and unstable? There is a fundamental economic concept that many people ignore this debate: the comparative advantage. This principle, developed by economist David Ricardo, explains that countries should focus on the production of what they do better and more efficiently, while exchanging goods with other nations that have advantages in other sectors. Tariff advocates argue that the US needs to recover its industry. But does this make sense within the logic of comparative advantage? What happens if a country tries to produce everything alone? Let's simplify. Imagine that China specializes in making cheap products, while the US dominates sectors such as technology, innovation, and financial services. Due to the logic of comparative advantage, the two countries should exchange with each other. Chinese would export manufactured products, and Americans would provide advanced technology and high-value added services. But what rates do is break this dynamic. When the US imposes commercial barriers, they try to force the internal production of goods that could be imported cheaper. This may even generate some short-term jobs, but in the long run, it impairs the efficiency of the economy. Companies will have higher production costs, prices go up, and the country's competitiveness can be reduced. The big question is, does the US really need to produce everything? Or should they focus on sectors where they are unbeatable and continue to import cheaper products from other countries? Tariffs look like a quick solution, but don't they end up generating more problems than they solve? If tariffs can generate inflation and make the economy less efficient, why do you insist on them? The answer lies in the political impact and the need for reconstruction of the American industrial base. For decades, the US has allowed entire industries to be transferred to countries such as China, Mexico, and Vietnam. The argument was simple: producing outside is cheaper, and US consumers benefit at lower prices. But this process had a huge social cost. Thousands of factories closed, industrial cities declined, and millions of well-paid jobs disappeared. Trump understood that this deindustrialization created enormous dissatisfaction in part of the American population. Industry workers lost their jobs and were forced to accept lower salary jobs in the service sector. By promising to bring factories back, Trump is not just talking about economics. He is talking directly to this voter base who wants to see the US again becoming an industrial giant. But here's the problem. Even if the rates encourage internal production, that doesn't mean factories will come back as they were before. Today, automation and robotics have replaced many industrial jobs. Even if a company decides to manufacture in the US, it will probably use less workers than in the past. So the real question is not just if tariffs can bring jobs back, but what kind of jobs they can create. Will industry protection really bring prosperity to American workers? Or will this strategy only increase costs without solving the real problem of unemployment? The real problem of global trade today is not just tariffs, but a deeply distorted economic system. Countries such as China, Germany, and Japan have maintained commercial surpluses for decades, while nations such as the US accumulate deficits. This is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate policies that transfer income from consumers to producers. China, for example, keeps its currency artificially devalued, This makes your exports cheaper and imports more expensive. The result? Chinese consumers have less purchasing power, while the government subsidies industries to flood the world with cheap products. In Germany, stagnant wages and labor reforms ensure that companies export more than they consume internally. These distortions create a vicious cycle. The US, as the largest global consumer, end up financing the excessive production of these countries. As straightening, the American commercial deficit is supported by public debt and easy credit. Meanwhile, surplus countries accumulate dollar reserves, which reinvest in US Treasury titles, perpetuating the cycle. But how long can this last? The dollar still dominates global trade, but signs of wear appear. China and other countries begin to diversify reserves, buying gold and avoiding the dollar in bilateral transactions. If this movement accelerates, the US will lose one of the pillars of its hegemony, the ability to finance deficits without immediate consequences. Here is the paradox. Trump's fares may be a desperate attempt to correct these distortions, but they also accelerate the fragmentation of the global system. When the US imposes barriers, they encourage other countries to create alternative commercial blocs, where the dollar loses relevance. The question that remains is, are rates a bitter medicine needed to rebalance the world economy? Or will they be the catalyst of an even greater crisis, where no one, neither the USA nor China, will be winning? Trump's decisions about tariffs are not just an economic policy. They are a high-risk bet that can redefine the future of the United States and the world. On the one hand, there is the promise of reindustrialization, jobs, and economic sovereignty. On the other, the ghost of inflation, commercial retaliation, and a global crisis. The story shows us that tariffs can be a two-edged knife. In 1930, they deepened the Great Depression. Today, however, the context is different. The US is no longer a surplus economy, but the largest global consumer. This means that the impact of tariffs can be less catastrophic or more complex. China, in turn, will not stand still. If tariffs threaten its export model, the country will retaliate with measures that may include yuan devaluation, restrictions on US companies, or even dollar attacks as a global currency. The risk of a total trade war is real, and its consequences would be unpredictable. What is at stake? For the US, the chance to recover industrial jobs versus the risk of inflation and economic isolation. For China, maintain your growth model versus face internal pressures for greater consumption and social welfare. For the world, a healthy economic rebalancing versus a fragmentation of global trade in rival blocs. And you, do you think Trump is right to challenge decades of free trade? Or are these tariffs a shot in the foot that will be expensive for all of us? Leave your opinion in the comments. This debate defines not only the future of the US, but the whole world economy. One thing is certain, the world will never be the same after these decisions. Whoever wins this economic war will dictate the rules of the 21st century. And if you think it doesn't affect you, think again.